Hello, friends, and welcome to The Practical Church Musician, a podcast of practical tools and ideas for volunteer and part-time church musicians everywhere. I'm Dr. Sam Fleming. Each week, we explore the real joys and challenges of serving as a church musician, whatever your denomination or background. From building your musical skills to managing the administrative side of a program, this show is here to support your growth and strengthen the work you do for your congregation. Thank you for being here today. Okay, so we're going to start with a little imagery here to start the episode off today. Picture this. You've been playing the piano for years, you're comfortable at the piano, and you play hymns at church, and you noodle around at home, and you love to play, but you're by no means a professional musician on any level. And then one day, your pastor, your bishop, your church leader, or maybe your music director approaches you and says, "Hey, we need an organist to help fill in. Would you do it?" And your stomach drops, because in your head you're thinking, I have never touched an organ. There are pedals, there are knobs. I don't even know what half these buttons do. There's no way I'm qualified to do this. But you say yes anyway, because someone has to, and you want to serve. Sunday comes, or maybe Saturday night, and you sit down at the organ for the very first time, and you stare at it the way you would stare at the cockpit of a 747, and you think, how does this even work? How do I do this? I think today's episode is going to be one that will go down in the books as a great starting point for anyone who is interested in learning more about the organ. There are a lot of really good resources out there already for pianists who want to transition to the organ or add the organ as an instrument that they play. And I'm going to be linking some of those today on our website, thepracticalchurchmusician.com, and also in the show notes. So speaking of this podcast, if you happen to find this or other episodes helpful, I hope that you'll leave a review. And I hope that you'll share it and like it. It helps the show grow and reach others who are interested in what goes on here. And I'm hoping to build up some good momentum as we get going. So growing up in the church that I grew up in, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, I knew that anyone could get asked to do anything to help serve in the church. If you're not aware, it is a completely lay ministry, so no one gets paid. And when you get asked to do something, you're getting asked to do it for free or to volunteer your time. So I knew growing up in this tradition that at some point I would probably, being a piano player, get asked to play in church. And I started playing in church at the age of 12. And that's kind of where my first introduction to the organ for myself was. And it was from watching somebody else who happened to be a trained organist. I would go and watch him play during prelude and postlude and stuff, and would ask him some questions and everything. And that's kind of what got me going, actually playing the organ myself. I was drawn to the organ long before that, but that's kind of how things got going for me. But one of the unique things here is that this is a completely volunteer position. Now, there's other faith traditions also that have volunteer musicians, and maybe you're in one of those traditions as well. So hopefully today's episode will be helpful to you if you are volunteering to play for church and you don't have a lot of background in the organ, but you want to start using the organ in your services. And so I hope that that this episode will help you. As a budding organist in my undergraduate degree, I was learning a lot about the organ, and I quickly realized how little training somebody would get at church for playing the organ. It's not like there was a professional organist on staff to teach you how to play the organ. And so if you got asked to play the organ for a Sunday morning service, or asked to serve in that position, you just kind of figured it out on your own. And if you were lucky, maybe you had somebody who knew more than you did and would teach you some more about the organ. And you just do your absolute best. And it makes for sometimes a really unique experience with the music, but at the same time, it also allows for a lot of growth and just a lot of opportunities to learn. So fast forward to when I was in college, in my undergraduate degree, learning a lot about the organ, and I realized how quickly people didn't have a lot of training on how to get started at the organ. Like, you go and you turn it on, and what do you do? Like, how does this thing work? How do you make it sound? What are the right sounds to use? What are all these buttons doing? And everything like that. So as a ambitious undergrad, I wrote what became the first edition of a little handbook geared particularly towards Latter-day Saint pianists, but I think is applicable across traditions because it really just focuses on the instrument. And it's called What Every Pianist Should Know About Playing the Organ. I've made several revisions of this booklet, and it is currently in its 4th revision right now that I hope to be publishing later on. And when I do, I will include that on the website as well. So today I will be approaching an introduction to the organ from the standpoint of a pianist who gets asked to play the organ and needs to learn some basic, really quick skills at the organ. Of course, nothing substitutes getting a teacher, taking private lessons, and spending many hours to develop the craft of organ playing. However, when you get asked to play and you only have a week or two before you start, you have to jump in with both feet and figure things out so you can support your congregation while developing this new skill. This episode will not teach you everything you need to know about being an organist, but it will be a good starting reference point to get you going. The Practical Church Musician Podcast is brought to you today by the Practical Church Musician Podcast. That's right, no fancy sponsor, no mystery promo code. Just me, the host, Dr. Sam Fleming, talking to you about the show. Look, here's the thing. Making a podcast about practical church music is, itself, a fairly impractical use of time. So, if you've made it this far, you're clearly the kind of person who appreciates that irony, and the kind of person who'd probably enjoy subscribing. So here's the ask. Hit follow, hit subscribe, whatever your podcast app calls it. It's free. It takes 4 seconds, and unlike most church volunteers, it requires 0 training and no awkward conversation with your music director about why you missed last week. I'll keep making the episodes. You just have to tap one button. That's the whole sponsorship deal. And if you're feeling really generous, leave the show a review. Now, this has been an ad for the thing you're already listening to, so let's get back to the show. Okay, so let's start with what we're actually looking at here. I'm going to give just a brief background on the organ, nothing too crazy, to help you understand how it functions. So the organ is ancient, and we're talking about going to the roots of ancient Greece and Rome, which makes it the oldest keyboard instrument by a wide margin. On a real pipe organ, sound is made by air rushing through pipes of different lengths. Different lengths make different pitches. Every pipe has a little stopper when you select a, quote, stop and press a key. A mechanism pulls that stopper back and lets air through. One pipe for one pitch. Now, if you group a bunch of those same sounding pipes together, up to 61 of them, one note per key, you've got what we call a rank of pipes. And each rank corresponds to one stop on the organ. And when we talk about a stop, we're talking about the different sounds or the different colors of the organ. So, for example, you might have like a flute sound or a trumpet sound or an oboe sound. Now, if you are playing an electronic organ, which is what most of us use when we are in these situations of volunteer work in church music, you are getting a simulation of that pipe and air mechanism happening, which is generated electronically. In other terms, we might say that you are getting a sound sample of different pipes, where different pipe organs or pipes have been recorded and meant to simulate the sound of a pipe organ. Now, this technology has come a long way, but it's still imitating something. It's not actually a pipe organ, but there are some convincing instruments out there that sound very similar to a pipe organ. Now, a typical church electronic organ might simulate around 32 ranks, somewhere in the ballpark of 1,700-ish individual pipe sounds. Now, for comparison, if you look at some of the large pipe organs in large churches or auditoriums, cathedral scale instruments maybe, these may have over 200 ranks and upwards of 11,000 actual pipes. So it's the same family of instrument, but a very different scale. Now with that, you'll also learn that every organ is a little different. It's not all going to be the same, but you can apply a lot of these basic principles we'll talk about across the board regardless of the instrument that you're playing. Okay, so let's talk about what's actually in front of you when you sit down at the organ. So most church organs have two keyboards stacked on top of each other, each with 61 keys. These are called manuals. A manual just means played with the hands, as opposed to the pedalboard down by your feet, which is obviously not played by the hands, but with your feet. So on a typical two-manual organ, the top manual is what we call the swell on an American organ, and the bottom manual is what we call the grate. You'll hear organists toss these words around like everyone just knows them, and now you do too, and that's what it's referring to at a basic level, the different keyboards of the organ. If you happen to play an organ that has more than two manuals, for example, if there are three on an American instrument, it is likely going to be the grate is the middle manual, the bottom manual is the choir manual, and the top manual is the swell manual. And then if you have a fourth manual, the top manual may be called the bombard or the solo division. All that to say, don't let this concept of two keyboards plus a pedal board intimidate you. It looks like a lot of moving parts, and it is a lot of moving parts, but it's learnable, and we're just going to break things down piece by piece so that you have an understanding of what's going on. So next, we're going to talk about what all these buttons are that you see on the organ. In the organ world, we call these buttons that you see underneath the keyboards, we call them pistons. And you'll see these rows of buttons, and they have numbers on them, and sometimes they have other things on them as well. And basically, pistons are a way that you can save different combinations of registrations. And the word registration is referring to the combination of sounds or the combination of different types of pipes or different types of ranks so that you can create different sounds at the organ. And you can get loud and soft, and all you have to do is press number 2 and you're off to the races. It's kind of like the presets in your car where you can set the radio, which I don't know that too many people listen to the radio anymore. But, you know, where you set the radio presets and you can just go from one station to the other. That's basically what the pistons do. Now, there's a few different flavors of pistons, and it's worth knowing the difference here just so that you don't get too confused. So we have what we call general pistons that control the entire organ at once. They control the grate keyboard, the swell keyboard, and the pedal. And these are usually numbered somewhere like 1 through 10 or 1 through 12. And you'll find them generally along the left side under both manuals. It'll start under the first manual, and then it'll go above to the second manual as well. Now, in the center of the keyboards of the different manuals, you will see numbers usually like 1 through 4, 1 through 5, 1 through 6, something along those lines. And we call those pistons divisional pistons because they only control one section or division of the organ. So the grate keyboard has pistons that you can control just the stops for the grate, and just the stops for the pedal, and just the stops for the swell. And those are generally in the center or down on the bottom what we call toe studs, which some organs have as well. So 2 additional pistons you should know by name. The first one we call the cancel piston, and it's sometimes labeled 0 or general cancel or something like that. And basically what that does is it clears all the stops that you have selected. And this is usually located under the great manual on a 2-manual organ or under the bottom manual of a 3 or 4-manual organ. Now, this button is great because you can set all your stops on your different pistons, on your general pistons and your divisional pistons. And then after you're done playing, you can hit the general cancel button, and you don't have to worry about accidentally hitting a pedal note or a note on the keyboard by accident in the middle of someone speaking or in the middle of a prayer or something like that. And it's really there as a safeguard to help you from one of those nightmares of full organ blaring unexpectedly during a quiet prayer because you forgot that it was on. And that's the great thing about saving all your presets ahead of time, is that you can hit your preset quickly and you can hit the cancel quickly, and it's just the push of one button. Now, the other button that you need to be aware of is what we call the tutti piston. And tutti means everything or all in Italian. And that's exactly what this does. It pulls every stop out at once for full organ sound. Now, most of the time, you're not going to use the tutti piston in your regular service playing, and it will absolutely flatten the room if you hit that. But it's fun to toggle and mess around with in practice, just so that you have a moment to experience full organ. But save it for moments that actually call for what we call the full kitchen sink. So another thing about pistons, registrations get saved to different memory levels on most modern organs today. So when you save a preset, it's important to understand how the memory levels work. And this is basically like its own level of all the pistons that you can save to. So check your organ. Some organs have little buttons that say M1, M2, M3, M4, and those are all different levels that you can save all the pistons to for one memory level. Other organs, it might be on like over by the on switch, and there's a little screen that you can arrow up and down. But it's important to recognize what memory level you're playing on, and make sure that you have a memory level that you can save things to. Otherwise, you might accidentally save your registrations or your stops over somebody else's. And if there are multiple people who play the organ, that can be frustrating, especially if somebody walks in Sunday morning to play and they think that they have all their stops set, and then things are not as they seem or as they had set them. So again, remember to consult others who play the instrument as well and ask about memory levels. All right, so next we are going to talk about all the different what we call stop tabs and couplers. So above the manuals, you'll see rows of rectangular switches, typically vertically, that are called rocker tabs. And they're actually what turn individual stops on and off. Now, on some organs, this is where this may vary a little bit, but you see the draw knobs that are on the sides of the organ. And these do the same things as most of these rocker tabs, these stop tabs. On a lot of electronic organs today, these stop tabs will light up when they are active. So at a glance, you can see exactly what's engaged. And you'll notice that they're grouped by section from left to right. The far left is what we call the pedal stops, or the pedal division. So that controls all the stops for the pedal. And then in the middle, the swell, and then on the right, the grate. And generally there's a little nameplate above each of those sections, so you know which stops correspond to which section of the organ. There's also a special category of rocker tabs called couplers. And a coupler is what links one division of the organ to another. So for example, if you have stops selected on the swell, but you want to play them on the great manual, you can select the coupler that says swell to great. And that takes everything that you've selected on the swell and adds it to the great manual. And it lets you play both registrations, swell and great, on a single keyboard. And you'll run into these in different variations, but typical ones are swell to great, swell to pedal, great to pedal. And then on larger organs, you might see something like swell to swell 4, swell to swell 16, which takes all the pitches and expands them an octave higher or lower than their sounding pitch, and all of those things. All right, so in this next segment here, we are going to talk about registration, and we're going to talk about the 4-stop families so that you can understand how to combine different stops, at least at a basic level, so you know how things work. So registration, the act of selecting different stops for a piece of music, is the art of combining stops to get the right color and weight for what you're playing. If you get it wrong or you don't get it, quite right, it changes the whole feel of the hymn. If it's too thin, it doesn't support the congregation, and people can't hear the organ and balance it with their singing. If it's too loud, you drown them out. If it's too quiet, etc. So you get what I'm saying here. Now, the good news is a lot of church organs come with a memory level of factory presets. So if you are just getting started and you don't want to dive into the world of registration yet, you can just go to the memory level, which is often memory level 1 on these organs, and you can go through and hit 1 through 10, and lots of times it's going to start. Number 1 is the most quiet stop, and number 10 is the loudest stop. But understanding the logic of how these combinations work is really helpful. So that's where we're going to dive into the 4 basic stop families. So the first stop family is what we call a principal. And principals are the foundational sound of the organ. When you picture an organ sound, most of the time you are hearing a principal stop in your mind. Now, these get used in almost every hymn. And so names, when you look at the organ to recognize, are things such as diapason, octave, principal, prestant, choral bass are just some examples. And those are from the principal family, and they have a lot of foundation and provide a lot of support. The next category, or stop family, is the flutes. And flutes, well, as you might imagine, they imitate that sound of a flute. And they are warmer lots of times and more mellow than principals. And they are often used to add some roundness underneath the principals. But they also work great as individual solo stops or quiet settings as well. Some names to recognize in the flute category might be bourdon, gedeckt, flute, spitzflute, piccolo. Now, the third category here is the string stops and the string family. And strings imitate string instruments, not in a literal sense, but they are meant to imitate the violins, the cellos, the violas of the orchestra. And these are beautiful stops. Typically, they're not used to accompany congregational singing. But these names that you might recognize are things like violon, gemshorn, viol, viola celeste. And that is at the most basic level. And of course, we can dive into more detail later on stops. Now, the last category are reeds. And reeds imitate the reeds and brass sections of an orchestra. So things like the oboes, the trumpets, the trombones. On the actual stop tabs, these are often printed in red, so you can spot them fast and recognize that they are reed stops. Names that you will see on the stop tabs for reeds include trumpet, pulsuana, oboe, chrome horn, French horn, clarion, hautbois, very many different names, but those are some of the basics for that one. Now, while not its own family of stops per se, there's a special category of stops that are worth knowing, and we call these mutation stops, or sometimes hybrid stops. And that is because they sit at unusual pitches. And so you'll see things like 2 2/3 and 1 3/5, like a Nazard or a tierce. And you're most of the time in church not going to use these alone. And these get layered on top of a solid foundation to add color. Another subcategory of this is what we call mixtures. And these are often going to be labeled with Roman numerals on them. And they combine several ranks of pipes at once. And they're almost always from the principal family. And again, they're never used alone, but they're like the icing on the cake. And they add brilliance and brightness to your registration. Another element we need to talk about now is this whole number thing that you see on all of these stops. So you'll notice that every stop has a number with a little tick mark next to it, kind of like an apostrophe. And you see the 8, the 4, 16, 2, so on. That number is how a pipe is measured in length, and that is all in feet. So when you see the 8 apostrophe, it's referring to 8 foot, 4 apostrophe, 4 foot. So basically it tells you what octave you're going to hear when you select a stop. To put this in perspective, when you select an 8-foot stop, this is going to play a pitch as you expect. So when you play middle C is going to sound exactly at the middle C pitch level. When you select a 4-foot stop, middle C is going to sound an octave higher than middle C. So it's like you're playing the C above middle C. And with a 16-foot, an octave lower, a 32-foot stop, 2 octaves lower from middle C, a 2-foot, 2 octaves higher. And so when you are layering your stops together, frequently you're going to select an 8-foot as your main fundamental pitch, because that is the sounding pitch of what you're playing. And then you might add a 4-foot or a 2-foot to add brightness, and then you might add a 16-foot or an 8-foot in the pedal to add depth and richer foundation. So then there's all those odd fractional numbers like 2 2/3, 1 3/5, 1 1/3, etc. These are all mutation stops that we just talked about. And for example, 2 2/3 adds a pitch a third above the octave. So it would be the E above the C above middle C. And again, don't ever use those alone. They are great for adding with foundational stops like the 8-foot principles and flutes. So here's a practical takeaway for hymn playing, just as you're getting started. For hymns, you typically want to use at least an 8-foot principle and a 4-foot principle in the manuals, and a 16-foot principle and an 8-foot principle in the pedal as your baseline. So that is the basics. As you're getting started, don't play hymns just on the 8-foot stops alone. The 4-foot is what lets the melody cut through and be audible to the congregation as they are singing. And then you can use other stops like the flutes, 8, 4, and 2, to warm things up, or a 2-foot principle to brighten things up, and maybe even a mixture. Or on some of the really big hymns, you can add the oboe or the trumpet or something like that. Now, if your organ has a stop like a festival trumpet or a tuba stop, that is what we call a solo voice. And that is meant for the melody on one hand and everything else played in the hands and feet in the left hand and the other feet. So typically you're not going to use the 8-foot tuba, for example, where you're playing with all of your hands at once. It would just be way too overpowering. Those are really loud. The Practical Church Musician Podcast is brought to you today by the Practical Church Musician Podcast. That's right. No fancy sponsor, no mystery promo code. Just me, the host, Dr. Sam Fleming, talking to you about the show. Look, here's the thing. Making a podcast about practical church music is, itself, a fairly impractical use of time. So, if you've made it this far, you're clearly the kind of person who appreciates that irony, and the kind of person who'd probably enjoy subscribing. So here's the ask. Hit follow, hit subscribe, whatever your podcast app calls it. It's free. It takes 4 seconds, and unlike most church volunteers, it requires 0 training and no awkward conversation with your music director about why you missed last week. I'll keep making the episodes. You just have to tap one button. That's the whole sponsorship deal. And if you're feeling really generous, leave the show a review. Now, this has been an ad for the thing you're already listening to, so let's get back to the show. Okay, so let's briefly talk about volume. On a digital organ, we kind of fudge this a little bit, and we can control the volume more. But on a pipe organ, there is no volume dial. Loudness primarily comes from how many stops you pull out. And the more stops you have, the more sound you get. Electronic organs follow the same logic, but they give you a little more flexibility. Above the pedalboard, you'll usually find 2 black pedals that maybe look like a gas pedal. The left one typically controls the volume for the grate manual and the pedal, and the right one controls the swell. Now, as a rule of thumb, the swell tends to run softer than the grate, and so typically you're going to do most of your hymn accompanying on the grate. And then if there's a third pedal to the far right, that's usually what we call the crescendo pedal, which gradually layers stops in or out as you push it open or closed. It's kind of like a built-in fader, if you think of it in that way. Now, the other thing to think about also here is within the context of a pipe organ, the grate division does not have, 90% of the time, does not have its own pedal to control quote-unquote volume. The swell and choir divisions typically do, and solo divisions often do also. And basically, on a pipe organ, the way this functions is that you have all the pipes, for example, the swell division, are sitting within a box that have swell shades, or they have shades on them that basically open and close as you open and close this foot pedal. And that controls volume in a different way. So you kind of get 2 ways to control volume there. Again, on the digital organ, it's a little different, and it gives us a little more flexibility in that way. Okay, so let's talk about prelude. And that's the music that plays before the service officially starts. And it's really easy to treat this music as just filler. But I'd like to push back on that a little bit. Prelude sets the tone for everything that follows in a worship service. And it is worth rehearsing ahead of time with the same care that you give the hymns. So if all you can play is a few hymns, maybe include that as your prelude. Now, a few practical notes on prelude. It's completely fine to just play hymns straight out of the hymnal for prelude. Just pick a registration that is appropriate to the setting that you're playing in. The other thing that you can do is you can look for prelude books. And maybe these are based on hymn tunes or other appropriate pieces that work well for prelude. Every faith tradition is going to have different styles of what works for your context. So figure out what works best for your context and choose music based on that. But there are lovely settings of hymns and other lovely music that can be used as prelude and postludes. So the heart of what you do at the organ is accompanying hymns. And so I wanted to touch on a few principles here. And this is really the biggest job for the organist. So the first thing is that you want to match your registration to the mood and the text of the hymn. If a hymn has a triumphant text or a contemplative text, you want the organ to match that. That way, it helps capture the spirit of that hymn. And your job is to find out for each verse what registration matches the hymn the best. So it's important to go through and read the text of the hymns and say, okay, what do I want to capture at the organ? What sounds do I want to capture that inspire singing and inspire the character of this text? Here is another thing to think about is tempo. When you are playing at the organ, it can be really easy to drag because you want to listen to the congregation who's listening to you play. And if the congregation, who's always going to be slower than you, sings slower, then you start listening to them. It's all, you're going to get stuck in the mud and you're going to be very slow by the end of the hymn. So if you can, get to a point where you can sing the hymn while you play. Now, of course, there are many things to focus on while playing the organ, but if you can get to a point where you sing the hymn while you play, it will help you keep the tempo correct. And it will help you breathe where you need to breathe and lift at the keyboard where you need to lift so that the organ is mimicking the human voice. And if the organ never breathes, the room never breathes either. And so you end up with people gulping for air in awkward spots and are just trying to keep up with your playing. So think about singing while you play to inform how you play. All right, so maybe the scariest part of the organ is the pedals. Now, I know pedals can look scary, and here's the truth. It's really just a keyboard for your feet. If you look down, it's the same notes. So it's the same logic and layout of playing with your hands. You're just doing it with your feet because it's a lot bigger. Traditionally, in full hymn playing, you are playing the soprano, alto, and tenor voices of a hymn with your hands, and then your feet take the bass line. And that takes a lot of practice to coordinate. There's no sugarcoating that. It just takes a lot of time to learn. But it's absolutely learnable, and if you stick with it in your own practicing, you will get it over time. And if you're not there yet or simply don't have pedal technique on your radar right now, there's a workaround on a lot of digital instruments. I've heard it affectionately called many times the cheater button. And this is what we call the bass coupler. And typically you'll find it either on the far left or on the far right of all the rocker tabs on the organ. And you'll see it'll say like bass or bass coupler. And what this does is it takes the lowest note that you are playing. So if you're playing a 4-part hymn, it takes the bass part of the hymn and it adds the pedal stops to what you're playing so that it sounds like you're playing the pedals, but you're not actually playing the pedals. Now, on some organs, it may be a little spotty, so just that's something to be aware of. But it helps you keep the pedal registration in the context of your hymn playing so that you get that full, rich, supportive sound that you need. All right, so we have a few things to cover here as we wrap up the episode. And we'll just hit these kind of quickly. First of all, the organ has no sustain pedal like the piano does. So when you press a key down and you lift it back up, the sound stops immediately. Not like the piano where you press the key down and hold the pedal down and it kind of decays out. The organ, you have to hold on to the key for the exact value of the beats that you're playing. So if you have a half note, you have to make sure that you hold it for a full 2 beats. There's no shortcuts there. And so you have to play with what we call more of a legato touch. And that will help you sound less choppy and disconnected. And honestly, the choppy and disconnected playing is one of the fastest ways to undercut congregational singing. It takes some adjustment if you're coming straight from piano technique, but it's worth the effort to learn to play legato and to play in this way so that you can provide support for your congregation as they're singing. Now, lastly, in these last couple quick tips here, practice matters more than anything else. So if you can get into your church building during the week and you can actually sit at the instrument, I highly encourage you to do it. Even 20 minutes on a weekday beats 0 minutes on Sunday morning. There's an old line that I love from a church leader that I had growing up as a youth. And he always used to say, proper prior planning positively prevents poor performance. And I talked about that quote last week. And it's one that will be a prevailing theme in this show because it is something that is just so important. And so if you take the time to properly practice, it will help prevent poor performance when Sunday comes. Now, of course, we are going to do our best. And in a church setting, we are all worshiping God, and we want to do our best to give God our best. And then we let him take care of the rest. And that's something that I share frequently with my students and with my church choirs that I work with. So we didn't cover everything there is to know about the organ, but nobody can cover everything in one episode. And honestly, you can't cover everything in one career either. But I hope that you walked away with a few principles. Number one, this instrument is not actually a mystery. There's pistons and stops, there's manuals and pedals, and there's registration, and there's a lot to learn. But you don't have to learn it all at once. So my challenge to you this week is to go and explore the organ at your church and explore and experiment some of these foundational concepts. Then use that as a springboard to keep learning more. Well, that's about it for today for episode 4. So if you found today's episode helpful, please like, follow, share, and subscribe on your favorite podcast platform to help spread the word. And be sure to find us on Instagram at The Practical Church Musician or on our website at thepracticalchurchmusician.com. As we wrap up episode 4, I invite you to join me next time as we explore another topic in the treasure trove of topics related to church music and service as a church musician. Until next time, keep singing, keep playing, keep practicing, and keep moving forward.